Welcome to Conspiracy Deconstructed. Today, we are jumping right into a case that, well, it's defined Australian cold cases for nearly 3/4 of a century. It's a case that became completely synonymous with the romantic and frankly terrifying world of Cold War espionage. Yet incredibly, in just the last few years, it's been totally rewritten. Not by spies, but by the meticulous, quiet work of modern science.
It really is the ultimate Cold War riddle, isn't it? All wrapped up in this cryptic message. For what, 70 years? The sheer depth of the mystery, it just allowed the most sensational theories to absolutely thrive. We're talking, of course, about the Somerton Man, or, as the case is maybe even better known, the Tamam Shud Case, named after that tiny, tiny scrap of paper found hidden in his pocket.
That's right. And before we get to the facts as we know them now, we really need to lay out the prevailing, long-held conspiracy theory. We need to state it in its most compelling, its most unvarnished form, because, honestly, it's become a foundational piece of Australian folklore. And, well, it's a heck of a story. So, picture this. The date is December 1st, 1948, Somerton Beach, just south of Adelaide, Australia. A man is found dead. He's propped up against the seawall. He looks distinguished, clean-shaven, wearing a suit, polished shoes, looks maybe mid-40s, perhaps 50s, but he's a complete ghost. No wallet, no cash. And here's the chilling part. Every single identifying tag, every label on every piece of clothing he's wearing, meticulously, painstakingly removed.
Yeah, the intention there, it was just screamingly obvious to the police right from the start. Yeah. Absolute premeditated anonymity.
Exactly. And the core theory that took hold almost immediately and really defined how the public saw this man for 7 decades was pretty simple. This was no ordinary death. This was a Cold War assassination. The man, he had to be a spy, an intelligence operative, poisoned by some untraceable, rapid-acting substance, probably administered by enemy agents operating right there in strategic post-war Australia.
It was kind of the perfect narrative storm for the time, wasn't it? You had this real-life spy thriller playing out, and it perfectly reflected those very real, very present global anxieties of 1948.
And the evidence of intrigue seemed almost theatrical. It felt like something out of a movie. Beyond the deliberate lack of ID, you had that truly bizarre hidden scrap of paper. Found months later, remember, tucked away in a tiny fob pocket, and it had the words Tamam Shud.
Which is Persian, meaning it is finished, or the end. And they traced that back to a specific, very rare edition of a book of poetry, the Rubáiyát of Omar Khayyám.
And then inside that book, a suspected cipher or code, 5 lines of what looked like just random capital letters.
So you had all the ingredients laid out, right? Poison, a secret code, total calculated anonymity. It felt almost too neat, really. Too perfect.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Let's start right at the beginning of the mystery and really get into the context that made that whole spy theory seem so fertile.
Right. We need to go back to the exact moment of discovery, December 1st, 1948, on that beach. But actually, the man was seen the evening before November 30th by 2 separate groups of people. Around 7 p.m., a couple saw him. Then, maybe 15 minutes later, around 7:15, a couple named Jack and Helen Lyons walked past. They noted he was lying there on the sand, near the wall, completely motionless. Jack Lyons even mentioned later that he saw the man weakly move his right arm up and then just drop it down again. They just assumed. Well, they assumed he was heavily drunk, maybe sleeping it off or about to pass out. They didn't think much more of it.
But he wasn't drunk. He was dying, and he was found in that exact same spot the next morning when police arrived. Some amateur jockeys out riding their horses reported the body. And this is crucial, isn't it? It strongly suggested he died right there where he was found, sometime between, say, 7:4 that evening and the next morning.
Physically, the descriptions were quite detailed. He was about 5'11" and looked, as you said, strikingly well kept, which immediately kind of contradicted the idea he was a vagrant or just some drunk. Clean-shaven, nicely clipped nails. And even though he was on a sandy beach, his shoes were still polished. His pockets contained this really bizarre mix of things. Some totally mundane, some, suspicious. Combs, a pack of unopened matches, juicy fruit gum, cigarettes, and bus and train tickets.
Okay, let's zoom in on the cigarettes for a second, because this tiny detail, it was something early investigators really seized on as a potential sign of misdirection. He was carrying expensive, imported Casitas brand cigarettes, right? But they were tucked into a cheaper, more common Australian Army Club packet.
Exactly. And there were sort of 3 main ways people interpreted that little detail. One, he was trying to camouflage his status. A professional agent needing to look local, maybe look cheaper, while still indulging his expensive taste. 2, maybe he was just reusing an old packet. Simple as that. But the third interpretation, the more sinister one, was that maybe the cigarettes themselves, or maybe just the filter tips, had been treated with the poison. And given the extreme care taken with removing all the clothing tags, well, nothing seemed too small to be potentially intentional.
The tickets were also confusing, weren't they? He had a used bus ticket for St. Leonard's, which is incredibly close to Somerton Beach, where he was found. But he also had an unused train ticket for Henley Beach, which is a completely different suburb nearby.
So already, his travel patterns seemed a bit off. It suggested maybe a last-minute change of plans, or perhaps even a deliberate attempt to mislead investigators about where he was actually going or who he might have been meeting when he arrived in Adelaide.
But the real clincher, the thing that really signaled the complexity right from the start, was the clothing itself.
Yes, the deliberate, methodical removal of all the tags and labels. From his coat, the trousers, his socks, the vest, everything. That was the undeniable, flashing red light for the authorities. This wasn't a simple heart attack or drowning. This looked like a planned, complex death.
So what were the initial forensic findings back in 1948? The things that shifted this from just an unknown body case to a potential high-level murder?
Well, the initial findings were alarming, mostly because of what wasn't found. There were no external signs of violence, no injury, no signs of a struggle, nothing like that. However, the internal autopsy, which was performed by a pathologist named Professor John Burton Cleland, revealed some significant internal issues. Specifically, congestion of the internal organs. Yeah. His spleen was severely enlarged, and there was congestion in his liver, his kidneys, and his entire upper digestive tract was congested too.
Okay, so that internal evidence suggested something foreign had entered his system and done so rapidly, but without causing the usual dramatic external symptoms you'd expect from common poisons back then, like, say, violent vomiting or convulsions.
Precisely. And during the inquest that followed, 3 different medical witnesses testified, and they all agreed that his death was not natural. Crucially, the city coroner, Thomas Erskine Cleland, no relation to the professor. By the way, he concluded in 1949 that death resulted from poison. But, and this is key, he was forced to categorize the death as indeterminate. He couldn't say if it was suicide, an accident, or homicide. And that ambiguity, that official stamp of poison, but we don't know how or why, well, that was the crack in the door that the spy theory basically kicked wide open.
And we absolutely have to talk about the historical context here, because that's what made this whole spy theory take root so deeply, isn't it? Why was it so ripe for adoption, specifically in Adelaide, specifically in 1948?
The global stage was perfectly set for suspicion. World War II had just ended, but the Cold War effectively began in 1947. That geopolitical divide was hardening fast. Espionage wasn't just stuff you read about in cheap novels. It was a deeply ingrained, genuinely terrifying reality for people. And Australia, particularly the area near Adelaide, housed some critical strategic sites that would have been highly attractive targets for Soviet intelligence or potentially other foreign powers.
Can you name those sites? Because their proximity really matters to this whole narrative.
Absolutely. Yeah. The 2 major ones people pointed to were the Radium Hill uranium mine, a source of material critical for the brand new nuclear age, and the Woomera test range. Woomera was a massive military research facility established just shortly before the Somerton Man appeared. It was highly secretive. Australia and Britain were conducting rocket research, defense technology development there. So the fear of spies infiltrating these key technological and military areas, well, it was a really common and accepted anxiety at the time. It made the narrative of an assassinated foreign operative instantly plausible. And frankly, probably politically useful too. It helped externalize some of that national anxiety.
Okay, so now we move into the actual evidence that kept the spy theory alive and kicking for 70 long years. Because proponents of this idea, they pointed to a specific set of clues. Highly circumstantial, yes, but also profoundly compelling. Clues that suggested high-level international intrigue, not just, a personal tragedy.
The first piece of evidence, and arguably the most theatrical, was that cryptic communication. We mentioned the Tamam Shud scrap. Remember, it was found hidden in that small fob pocket in his trousers months after the body was first discovered. The police actually missed it initially.
Right. And the detail of it being hidden is so vital, isn't it? It wasn't just in his wallet. It was stitched away. And that single 2-word phrase led to what was, at the time, the real breakthrough. Investigators managed to trace it back to a very rare, specific edition of that 12th century Persian poem, the Rubáiyát of Omar Khayyám.
Yeah, this is where this story really becomes almost cinematic. The police put out a public appeal based on the unusual text. And in July 1949, months later, a local man came forward. He said he'd found a copy of the Rubáiyát just tossed into the back of his unlocked car near Somerton Beach, right around the time the man died. And the key thing, investigators discovered that the torn fragment from the man's pocket perfectly matched the missing final page of this discarded book. They had the source text.
And inside that specific, rare edition, that's where they found the goldmine of supposed espionage intrigue. You had that handwritten, suspected code, 5 lines of seemingly random capital letters. And, critically, the unlisted phone number of a woman, a nurse named Jessie Jo Thomson, who lived incredibly close to where the body was found.
For anyone leaning towards the spy theory, this was basically an open and shut case of agent communication. They instantly saw it as a classic book cipher, maybe an Ottendorf cipher, which was historically used in espionage circles. The whole system relies on both the sender and the receiver having the exact same edition of a book, often a rare one. The code would then typically be a sequence of numbers referring to page, line, and maybe word number within that specific book.
And that system gives you plausible deniability, right? If a spy gets caught with the book, they can just claim they enjoy poetry. If they're caught with the coded message, well, it's just meaningless gibberish unless the interceptor has the exact corresponding book.
Precisely. So the rarity of that Rubáiyát edition, combined with the presence of this apparent code and the phone number of a potential local contact like Thomson, well, it felt exactly like a secret message. Maybe instructions for a rendezvous or final orders.
Okay, now let's turn to the other major cornerstone of the spy theory, the alleged murder weapon. Or maybe, more accurately, the lack thereof, this idea of an untraceable poison.
Right. The coroner's inquest heard expert testimony that really cemented this idea. Professor Cedric Stanton Hicks, who was a key witness, confirmed that there was a specific group of drugs known at the time. Drugs that were highly toxic in very small oral doses and, critically, were nearly impossible to detect, even if toxicologists specifically went looking for them back then.
So the inference, which really circulated widely, was that this must have been a sophisticated state-level kind of kill. We learned much later these substances were likely cardiac glycosides, things like digitalis or uabane, drugs that mess rapidly with heart function and metabolism.
Correct. And the key difference was that the common household poisons available in 1948, things like arsenic or strychnine, they caused really dramatic, undeniable symptoms, awful convulsions, massive vomiting, and they left traceable residues. The Somerton Man's physical evidence that internal congestion, the enlarged spleen, it didn't really suggest those common poisons. So the spy interpretation argued this had to be some kind of foreign-developed poison used by a professional killer who needed to leave absolutely zero traditional forensic trace. It basically confirmed, in their view, the existence of high-level international espionage happening right there in Adelaide. The failure of 1940s toxicology was simply recast as proof of advanced enemy tech.
And finally, the third piece of this circumstantial puzzle, the meticulous preparation for anonymity and all those layers of apparent misdirection.
Yeah, we've covered the tags being removed from every single piece of clothing. That certainly points towards intended anonymity. But the puzzle got even deeper when that brown suitcase turned up. It was found at the Adelaide railway station about a month after the body was found. Inside, among other things, there was a spool of unusual, very fine orange thread, and it exactly matched the stitching used to repair a tear in the dead man's trousers. That provided a concrete link between the suitcase and the man.
But the suitcase was, kind of paradoxically, both concrete proof of identity in a way, and also a source of more confusion. If he was so intent on being anonymous, why leave a suitcase with items inside, like a tie, an undershirt, a laundry bag that were labeled with variations of the name T. Keen or Keen?
Exactly. It suggested either a clumsy mistake by an otherwise professional spy, or maybe it was a purposeful double bluff, some kind of false trail. And that ambiguity just added more fuel to the spy narrative. The clothes in the suitcase, including a coat that was manufactured in the U.S., suggested he wasn't actually local to Australia. Furthermore, those travel documents we mentioned, the unused train ticket for Henley Beach versus the used bus ticket that took him near the nurse's house, that suggested a calculated attempt to obscure his real destination or maybe his intended contact point. Every little detail, from the expensive cigarettes in the cheap box to the potential use of a family name like Keen as maybe a pseudonym, it all seemed perfectly engineered to mislead any investigators. Right. So these three elements, the code, the poison, the anonymity, they formed this hypothesis that was so tight and honestly so compelling that it defined this mystery for literally generations. But now we have to move into the deconstruction, the fact check, and the moment when modern science finally intervened and started dismantling 70 years of, well, Cold War spy schlock. Check. And this is actually the most fascinating part of the whole journey, I think, because the initial scientific efforts, the first attempts to really apply modern science, they actually led researchers down this massive, really emotionally charged rabbit hole. A path that proved to be completely incorrect in the end, but yielded an incredibly valuable lesson in the process.
You're talking about the initial deconstruction effort led by Professor Derek Abbott, the one that focused on Jessie Thomson's son, Robin. That theory was so compelling for a while because it relied on these allegedly super rare physical traits.
That's right. The hypothesis got a lot of publicity. It relied on the idea that the Somerton Man and Robin Thomson shared two very specific, supposedly highly rare physical anomalies. One was congenitally missing lateral incisors, that's the teeth right next to your two front teeth, and the other was an enlarged cymba, which is a specific little depression in the outer ear structure.
And Abbott initially speculated, based on this, that the Somerton Man might have been Robin's biological father. And the theory went that Jessie Thomson, perhaps fearing exposure of a past affair, had failed to identify him, and maybe even somehow orchestrated his death using the code, the poison talk, to protect her new life and her family.
But here's deconstruction point A, the medical fact check that just completely dismantled this entire familial link. Dental experts later clarified that missing lateral incisors, the condition is called hypodontia, it's actually extremely common. It is not the rare genetic marker the theory hinged upon. It's the most common type of toothagenesis, in fact. Furthermore, some initial police reports suggested the Somerton Man was actually missing quite a few teeth, probably due to extractions over his life, not congenital defects, which makes the whole argument highly speculative and really difficult to prove definitively from the remains.
Wow, so the entire foundation, this romantic, decades-long theory of a forbidden love triangle, maybe even murder, it was basically built on a misunderstanding of dentistry.
Pretty much, yeah.
It's also quite remarkable, isn't it, that Professor Abbott actually ended up marrying Rachel Egan, who was Robin Thomson's granddaughter, during the course of his research. It shows just how intertwined the personal became with the professional in this case.
It really does. And that personal investment, in a way, highlights the integrity of the scientific process itself, which is really the whole point of this part of our discussion. But first, let's quickly revisit the other foundational pillars of the spy theory, starting with that code, the one that stumped cryptologists for decades.
Okay, deconstruction point B, the code. For generations, cryptologists were baffled by those 5 lines of faint capital letters found in the back of the Rubáiyát. People tried everything, didn't they? Every known cipher system, substitution ciphers, transposition ciphers, and nothing really worked reliably.
Well, when modern professional analysts applied statistical tests to it, the structure just didn't match known secure cryptographic methods. Things like the Vigenère cipher or Polybius square systems. You see, a true cipher is designed to evenly distribute the characters. It tries to obscure the natural frequency of common letters like E, T, or A in English. But analysis showed the distribution of letters in the Somerton code was heavily spiked. There was an overwhelming frequency of M's, A's, and T's.
Wait, what does that concentration tell you definitively? How can you be sure it's just random notes versus, say, a badly failed code?
Well, the heavy spike proves it's not statistically random in the way a good cipher would make it appear. It lacks the structure needed for a serious, secure encryption. If it were, say, a Vigenère cipher, those common letters would be scattered much more evenly by the key, since they weren't. The conclusion reached by many cryptologists now is that the code probably lacked the sophistication or the structure of a real cryptographic code. It was most likely, they think, just hastily jotted notes, maybe the first letters of words from a poem, or maybe even notes related to gambling, or perhaps a personal rendezvous, but almost certainly not a high-level military communication.
That is a massive blow to the whole espionage narrative, isn't it?
Huge.
So the code turns out to be probably just confusing handwriting. What about the untraceable poison that supposedly killed him? Does that hold up?
The poison story also starts to lose its footing under modern scrutiny, largely because of the primitive limitations of 1940s technology. As one expert noted, forensic toxicology back then was severely limited. They often relied on pretty crude chemical precipitation tests, or maybe looking for color changes when they used really large samples of tissue or fluid.
So if the toxicologist, Professor Hicks, was looking for a specific compound, he basically had to guess what it might be first, right? He couldn't just run a general screen.
Exactly. He needed a fair idea of what to look for to even have a chance of succeeding. So the failure to identify a specific poison wasn't necessarily proof of some advanced foreign technology. It was actually pretty much expected if this substance wasn't one of the common household or industrial poisons they knew well, like mercury or arsenic. Furthermore, those cardiac glycosides we mentioned, like digitalis, they're actually metabolized quite quickly by the body. They act fast, but then they break down into minute traces. traces that 1940s techniques simply couldn't isolate without specific protocols and equipment that just didn't exist yet.
And the physical evidence itself, those enlarged, congested organs that so many people took as proof of some exotic poison, couldn't they simply be attributed to a pre-existing medical condition? Especially since we know the original detailed pathology report is lost. All that remains is this imprecise, summarized transcript of the court testimony. We can't definitively confirm the cause of death was poison at all, can we? Only that the experts at the time thought it was, based on those internal findings.
That's right. The narrative that the poison was untraceable because of advanced foreign science is, well, it's far less likely than the simple fact that the tests available back then were just insufficient. This really removes the final major pillar supporting that whole espionage theory.
Okay, so if the rare physical traits turned out to be common, the code was probably just random notes, and the untraceable poison was likely just a failure of 1940s technology. What finally cracked the case? This brings us to deconstruction point C, the definitive DNA identification. This really is the triumph of modern forensic science.
Yeah, this breakthrough was again spearheaded by Professor Abbott, working closely with the renowned forensic genealogist Colleen Fitzpatrick. The major challenge, obviously, was getting viable DNA after more than 70 years, especially since the body had been exhumed and later reinterred, and the remains were likely damaged by embalming fluid from the 40s. The source of the DNA that finally worked. It came from hairs, specifically about 15 strands of hair that had been extracted from the Somerton Man's plaster death mask, which had fortunately been preserved in the South Australian Police Museum.
And the process itself, it highlights how quickly technology can just render old forensic rules completely obsolete, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Back in, say, 2015, the conventional wisdom was that you absolutely needed the hair root to get viable nuclear DNA.
That's right. Police forensics typically focus on something called STRs, short tandem repeats. These are highly concentrated in the root, and they're excellent for direct, specific individual identification. Matching a suspect directly to a crime scene sample. Abbott and his team were initially really obsessed with finding those roots. But the first attempts were disappointing because that soft root material degrades really quickly over 70 years, especially after it's been exposed to chemical embalming fluids.
But the breakthrough came when, almost sounds like out of desperation, researchers sent a 5-centimeter length of the hair shaft, the visible part, with no root attached to a specialized lab in America, a lab that focused on these advanced genealogical techniques. Why did this seemingly useless piece of hair shaft pay off so spectacularly?
It basically overturned decades of forensic wisdom. The shaft provided what are called SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. Now, unlike STRs, which are unique individual markers, SNPs are used more for population genetics, for building family trees. They trace ancestral lineages. And the reason the shaft worked so well, the hair root, being soft and spongy, it degrades quickly over 70 years, destroying the DNA. But the strong, dense keratin protein sheath of the hair shaft, it turned out, was excellent at preserving the smaller, fragmented SNP segments over that long time it protected them. That allowed the lab to extract the necessary 2 million DNA markers they needed for the genealogical analysis.
That is genuinely mind-blowing. The part they thought was useless was actually the key. It solved a 70-year mystery by essentially giving them an ancient family tree to work with. And who did this massive DNA effort finally point to? Who was the Somerton Man?
The DNA traced the man back to Charles Webb. He was born on November 16, 1905 in Footscray, which is a suburb of Melbourne. He was an instrument maker by trade, and he was the 6th child of a German immigrant baker.
The sheer amount of genealogical work involved here must have been absolutely staggering. How did they confirm it wasn't just, say, a distant match on the tree?
They had to build out this enormous family tree using public records, census data, genealogical databases. It eventually included about 4,000 people. They were looking for living relatives who matched the Somerton Man's DNA profile. They finally confirmed the identity by finding a living granddaughter of one of Webb's sisters, a woman named Doris. She had a huge DNA overlap with the Somerton Man's DNA. That provided the necessary scientific confirmation.
And this identification immediately sheds new light on some of that old circumstantial evidence, doesn't it? Particularly the T. Keene name found on the tie and the laundry bag in the suitcase.
Absolutely. While that name was chased extensively for decades as a possible pseudonym or code name, it turns out Webb's actual family tree included people with the surname Keene. So it was most likely just a common family name coincidence. Or perhaps the clothing simply belonged to a relative who had previously stenciled their name on it. It wasn't some elaborate spy code after all. That whole layer of intrigue just evaporated instantly once Webb was identified.
So the legendary Cold War spy is now Charles Webb, an instrument maker from Melbourne. What does his background actually tell us about why he might have been on that beach? This brings us to deconstruction point D, the mundane tragedy.
Webb's life, as far as we can piece it together, wasn't the stuff of international espionage at all. It was much more a story of personal stress, family loss, and potentially financial difficulty, things quite common in that post-war era. We know he married a woman named Dorothy Jean Robertson, who was a foot specialist back in 1941. However, by 1948, the year he died, his marriage appears to have been in severe trouble.
Right, we have specific details from divorce papers filed later, don't we? And they weren't exactly flattering about him.
No, they paint a picture of quite a bit of domestic strain. The divorce papers described him as a troubled guy, someone who got intensely angry, apparently, when losing at cards. He was known to have lost his temper frequently, which suggests maybe significant emotional volatility lurking beneath that polished, well-kept exterior people saw on the beach.
And this detail about cards, it connects to some speculation that he might have been involved as a nit keeper, like a lookout in illegal baccarat games that were happening in Melbourne around that time. Those games were under intense police scrutiny in 1948. So if he was involved in that kind of illicit high-stakes activity, well, leaving Melbourne suddenly for Adelaide starts to make a lot more sense. Maybe it was an escape from domestic trouble, or maybe legal trouble, not some global spy mission.
His personal life was also deeply marked by grief and loss. His father died back in 1939. His mother followed just a few years later in the early 1940s. And his brother, Roy, died tragically as a prisoner of war in Japanese captivity during World War II. Furthermore, the genealogical record showed that most of his siblings actually died relatively young, often only in their 50s, usually due to heart issues, which was likely related to the high levels of smoking and just general stress common in that generation. So Webb herself, in 1948, was experiencing a marriage breakdown, dealing with profound personal stress and potentially had underlying health issues.
So his journey to Adelaide, it might have been driven by this immense emotional, maybe even physical strain, possibly compounded by a pre-existing health condition. The very kind of condition, perhaps, that could mimic internal poisoning if it was exacerbated by stress, or maybe even by medication he was taking. This totally recontextualizes those congested organs found in the initial autopsy.
It's a remarkable shift, isn't it? Yet also profoundly sad. The man whom the world, for decades, sort of needed to be this sophisticated, glamorous spy, turns out to be a struggling Australian tradesman, likely in the throes of a deep personal crisis.
And this brings us perfectly to part 5, the human element. Why? Why did this man become such an enduring icon of espionage? Now that we know his identity, Charles Webb, and we know a bit about his personal history, why was that spy narrative so much stickier, so much more enduring for so long than the likely truth?
Well, the appeal of intrigue is just immense, isn't it? Because it tends to replace chaos with purpose. Think about it. The removed tags, the code, the mysterious untraceable death. These details fit perfectly into that post-World War II cultural appetite for spy stories, for complex hidden narratives. That narrative gave the public a complex, maybe even international enemy to focus on. It provided a clear external source of threat, rather than confronting the messy, often frightening reality of personal tragedy, potential suicide, or even just a domestic dispute gone wrong.
So you're saying the spy narrative offered a kind of psychological control. If he was a spy, his death had a high-stakes reason behind it. It was part of some larger organized plot that maybe the police and intelligence services could eventually figure out and solve.
Exactly. Whereas if he was Charles Webb, his death was likely just a sad, uncontrolled tragedy, driven by things like familial loss, personal stress, maybe mental health issues. That reality is messy, it's much less satisfying, and it's harder for the collective public mind to process than some grand conspiracy. It also fed into that idea that ordinary people could possess secret knowledge that they, the armchair detectives, could be the ones to crack the hidden code and expose the underlying truth. That's much more engaging than, say, analyzing dry 1940s toxicology reports.
And this case also serves as a brilliant illustration of the mindset of a good scientist, doesn't it? Specifically thinking about Professor Abbott again. He spent years developing a really strong circumstantial case, that Robin Thomson father hypothesis, focusing on those supposedly rare traits. But he readily and publicly abandoned it when the DNA evidence pointed definitively elsewhere, towards Charles Webb.
He actually noted that a scientific hypothesis shouldn't be an emotional attachment. His previous hypothesis was probably the best possible explanation, given the very limited evidence they had at the time. But when the new verifiable data, that S&P analysis from the hair shaft emerged, well, the scientist's job is to follow the evidence, period. Even if it completely contradicts everything they might have spent years believing or working on, that's the organic, sometimes difficult, but evolving nature of science in action.
Which brings us pretty much to where the mystery stands today. Because even though we finally know his identity as Charles Webb, those core questions about his final hours in Adelaide, they remain deeply mysterious, don't they?
Absolutely. We still don't know for sure how he traveled from Melbourne to Adelaide, for one thing. Did he hitchhike? Take a bus? We don't have a record. And we still have that significant, roughly 8-hour gap in time on November 30th, 1948. We know he checked his suitcase at the Adelaide train station around 11 in the morning. He then took that bus out towards St. Leonard's at about 11:15 a.m. But he wasn't spotted on the beach, apparently dying, until 7:15 that evening. What happened in those 8 hours?
That missing time feels critical now. Did he meet Jessie Thomson, the nurse whose unlisted phone number was in the back of that Rubáiyát? The records show she lived incredibly close to the St. Leonard's area where he took the bus to. It seems too coincidental to ignore.
And Jessie Thomson's reaction when the police showed her the death mask years later. I mean, reports say she appeared completely taken aback, to the point of giving the appearance she was about to faint. That strongly suggested she knew him, regardless of whether he was Robin's father or just some other acquaintance from her past, whether any meeting they might have had resulted in an altercation or maybe prompted a suicide or was perhaps linked to a non-spy-related murder. That remains the ultimate unresolved question. It's worth noting the police files themselves, right from day one, always leaned more towards suicide, suspecting maybe a self-administered overdose.
So the ultimate cause of death is still the last great piece of evidence we just don't have. The theory of an untraceable spy poison seems greatly diminished now that we know he was an instrument maker dealing with immense personal stress and that his family had a history of heart issues. It makes possibilities like self-medication gone wrong, an accidental overdose, or even intentional suicide seem much more plausible.
And the sheer effort he apparently went to, stripping all those tags from his clothing. It really does suggest someone deliberately seeking oblivion, or at least complete anonymity in death, far away from his home and his troubled life in Melbourne. The sophistication of the mystery, in the end, might have been entirely in the presentation of the body, and the simple failure of 1940s science to immediately figure it all out.
So we went from arguably Australia's most dramatic, high-stakes Cold War mystery to the quiet, sad truth of a troubled man who died far from home due to unknown but likely very personal circumstances. DNA technology truly rewrote this history, didn't it? Demonstrating that sometimes the most profound revelations come not from the drama of spycraft, but from the incredibly detailed, meticulous analysis of a single strand of hair.
The Somerton Man story, or Charles Webb's story rather, is a profound lesson, I think. It shows that even the most theatrical and complicated mysteries, the ones with codes and poisons and hints of international intrigue, can often simply mask a very human, perhaps very mundane tragedy. A tragedy driven by deep personal stress, loss, and difficult relationships. So the real question, perhaps, is this. Knowing the complexity of his personal life now, why did the world seem to need Charles Webb to be a spy for so long, rather than just accepting him as perhaps a broken man who sought anonymity in his final moments?
That's an excellent thought to ponder. We hope you enjoyed this exploration into the truth behind the Tamam Shud Case, the Somerton Man, Charles Webb. What part of this story stands out to you the most now? Is it the enduring mystery of that missing time on his last day, the incredible unexpected breakthrough of the DNA from the hair shaft, or just the crushing weight of his apparent personal life? Let us know what you think.